Behind the well-edited, entertaining exterior of Dungeon Crawler World lies an ugly reality that is filled with exploitation. I discuss this and more on today's episode. Welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I have found in my travels. Today I want to talk about a book that I read, one that focuses on talking cats and aliens. I am referring to Dungeon Crawler Carl, book 1 in the series by Matt Dinniman, which was published in 2020. For those who don't know, Matt Dinniman is an American writer who lives in Washington State, a white American writer. He's been getting his work published for about the past 15 or so years, but is probably more well known for stuff that he got published recently, which includes the Dungeon Crawler Carl series, which focuses on the titular Carl as he tries to make his way through a dungeon created by an alien species that is designed to basically kill people for entertainment. And he writes a lot of science fiction and fantasy and things like that. And he's got won some popular regard for his work, won a couple of awards, a little bit of notoriety. I know the Dungeon Crawler Carl series is pretty popular, and people have been telling me I need to read it for quite some time. Yeah, that's pretty interesting right there. Very fascinating writing. I really enjoyed this, and spoilers for what I'm going to say later, but I do have a few problems with it. I should also note that because this came out in 2020, I'm going to avoid spoiling major elements, or at least the last 100 or so pages. Be sure to, go read this on your own and come back and check out my review, because I might spoil some things in the analysis section. But without further ado, let's talk about Dungeon Crawler Carl. I'll do a summary, a little bit of analysis, and we'll move on from there. So Dungeon Crawler Carl focuses, of course, on Carl. He is a former member of the Coast Guard who does not have time for drama. At the beginning of the book, we learned that he is breaking up with his girlfriend and planning to steal her cat because he saw photos of her in like France or something like that, cheating on him. And so he is just like, I'm going to break up with her, and then I'm going to take the cat because he's grown attached to the cat. The cat's name is Princess Donut, at the beginning of the story, Princess Donut escapes outside. Carl has to go outside in his boxers, and at this point, all of the buildings kind of vanish and kill everyone who's still inside the buildings. An AI voice announces that aliens from the Borant Corporation or the Syndicate have invaded, and they have laid claim to Earth's resources because nobody else, laid claim to it. Pretty much lying right there. Basically, if the people who are still alive want to survive, they have to go through the dungeons that are opening up, through the stairways that are creating portals in the Earth. Basically, if you make it through the dungeons, you get to claim Earth's resources and all of the fabulous prizes there. But as we find out, nobody has really done that before. Carl decides that he's too cold because he's in his boxers, and he heads into the dungeon with Princess Donut. He fights off some goblins and then makes his way to a tutorial guild where he runs into Mordecai, one of the NPCs of this dungeon, basically functioning like a video game of sorts, who tells him all about the rules and instructs him on how to the best practices and things like that. Carl ends up deciding to use his fist and his feet in an effort to kill the things in the dungeon. And because Princess Donut got a special power-up, she can now talk, and she is also an active participant in the dungeon. And Carl and her kind of become close friends and compadres and things like that. They leave the tutorial guild, head into a restaurant area, and watch the Dungeon Crawler World TV show, which highlights specific people. Carl and Princess Donut are hoping to get featured because it'll get them more resources in the future. They end up fighting a hoarder boss that has cockroaches coming out of its mouth. Carl feels bad, but he ends up killing this boss. And then he makes his way to a goblin camp, which he has free passage because of a tattoo that he got in his inventory. He basically trades bad llama meth, to the goblins in exchange for a motorcycle that they make for him, which helps him get through the dungeons faster. He then tells the goblins where to get more of the meth. They go off and do that, and then Carl kind of loots and steals from the goblins and kills the boss of the area. Again, he feels kind of bad because there were children in the boss area that died too, but he notes that's the fault of the creators because they kind of made that they programmed the game to be like that. Carl and Princess Donut discover that a crawler named Frank has been killing other crawlers, including one named Rebecca, in the dungeon, Carl is on the lookout for him because he's upset about that. He ends up running across them, and they sort of try to set a trap to kill Princess Donut and Carl, but they can't do that in safe rooms, so they get frozen, and then Carl leaves, sets a trap for them, but never finds out if it actually exploded or not because they drive off. They then run into a group of retirement home people, including the workers who are trying to keep the elderly residents safe, and the elderly residents who don't really know what's going on and are in no position to kind of defend themselves. But Carl agrees to work with these people to kind of keep them safe for a little bit, and they decide to work together to defeat a bigger burrow boss that is blocking the way to the next set of stairs that can get them down to level 2. In order to do that, Princess Donut and Carl train. They fight a juicer boss, and then they defeat the burrow boss, which is just a ball of swine, a bunch of pig creatures. And then after they do that, they are summoned to an interview show because they are a hot commodity and very popular amongst the people at this point. Carl has an interview with Odette, who used to be a dungeon crawler in a previous season, and that she gives him some tips on how to sort of do things and how to survive. They're just prominently featured. They end up on floor 2, and there's more interviews that their PR manager Zev is going to assign to them, and it's also at this point that Carl learns that the Bourne Corporation and the Syndicate are kind of in a hurry to finish this game, so that they can make as much money as possible and pay off their debtors in the galaxy that they're in. And from there, the rest of the story takes place. Carl runs afoul of a rage elemental. How he does that and the process of how that gets defeated and what else happens in the story, I'll let you find out, but I will be talking about those elements in the analysis section, so beware of those spoilers. In terms of analysis, there is quite a bit worth talking about with Dungeon Crawler Carl. Pretty solid book, very fascinating, a lot of compelling writing, but also a few problems that I'll note as we go along. One of the main themes that I think we see here is that of the theme of exploitation. Dinniman highlights the exploitive nature of the Bourne Corporation, of the Syndicate, and of Dungeon Crawler world at large, because this is a TV show that is being run by this larger government world, or galactic government, in an effort to make money for each of the systems, each of the worlds that exist there, but at the same time, the worlds where they're taking place on are being exploited and being resources are being stolen. They're essentially pillaging the earth for resources. It's a Hunger Games style fight for the people who choose to be crawlers. They don't have to kill each other, but some of their mentors are telling them to kill other crawlers for a benefit, for the upper hand in the world. So it's kind of a very manipulative style of doing things, and it's all of it is just for views, for revenue, because if people get views, then that means that people are willing to pay the corporation, the planet system that's hosting this, additional money, and that's revenue for that group. So they're kind of incentivized to make it as entertaining as possible, which again comes at the expense of the people who are stuck in the game and just trying to survive so that they can make it out and go live in the ruins of the world that was kind of like where all the resources were stolen. But again, like in this particular story, like the Bourne Corporation wants to speed things up. They want to make as much money as possible through sponsorships, through letting other crawlers kind of pay their way, or like former crawlers or even just outside people pay their way in to kind of hurt crawlers. That's going to become a factor in later books, I hear, but that's kind of the what's going on in the story right now. A lot of exploitation, a lot of capitalism at play here, and I think what Dinniman is arguing is that capitalism, greed seem to be universal, like it's something you're going to find everywhere. Kind of pessimistic. I don't necessarily agree, but I understand where Dinniman is coming from here. Now, I do think it's a very fascinating message overall. And he's doing a lot of great work with the exploitation, but at the same time, I did describe it as a Hunger Games style fight. So I'm using language from other books to describe what's going on here. So Dinniman's clearly not the first person to do it. It's a very novel way of telling this type of story, but it is retreading, familiar ground, I would say. It's also important to talk about the ugly reality of this competition as a whole. The dungeon is presented as entertainment, a real hoot and a holler for the people who are watching, must-see TV and things like that. But the reality is pretty grim as to what is actually happening here. The crawlers are suffering. They have to fight to survive, and they might get wounded or maimed or things like that. But for the NPCs in the game, they can actually feel. Many of the NPCs are sapient, like the goblins or other creatures, and they're being told that if they keep fighting, if they kill enough dungeon crawlers, they might be able to make it to the lower levels where there's no more dungeon crawlers and they can live pretty peacefully. They can raise their families that apparently they're raising in the dungeons, which creates a whole host of other sort of moral quandaries. But the essence is, these people have histories. You're not simply killing creatures that can't feel, although you are sometimes. But you're still killing like real creatures, real sapient, intelligent kind of warriors or something like that have feelings and are just trying to thrive on their own. There's a grim reality there that kind of makes the entire process feel hopeless and like we're all just being pit against one another, which is often the case of what's happening in the real world. But you also have dead crawlers, which when Carl sees that, he doesn't feel good about what's going on here. He, particularly when he sees Rebecca's corpse in this story, who was killed by Frank, he's like, how could one person do this to another person? And he realizes that this is not just some sort of fun joke. There's actual consequences at play here. Allow me to read you an interesting quote from this. I looked down at the dead woman. I wonder who she was, why someone like her was outside at 2:30 in the morning on such a night. I'm never going to know her story. Nobody is ever going to know it. I wonder how scared she'd been. Only to be killed by a fellow human. He'd looted her corpse, taking everything, leaving only an apple core. It made me irrationally angry. In fact, I think you're right. I want to find him if we can, which that's what Carl is saying to Princess Donut at the end, but he's asking a lot of questions about this and how, killing another human is like a big deal, but here in the dungeon, they're encouraging it. There don't seem to be any real consequences to that, and so when you encourage the worst base human behavior, like people really stop being human. You're kind of breaking them in a way, which Carl says, you're not going to break me. You're not going to get me to turn against other people and accept this as a normal thing that deserves to happen or should be happening. And you see this more and more as Carl progresses, like this sort of frustration with the system, because there are elderly sort of retirement home people in the story, and Carl wonders like what hope is for them if they survive this floor. is that worth getting to the next floor where things are going to get harder? Like, are they really going to make it to the end, or are you just prolonging the inevitable for them to get to a really painful death sometime later? And that just frustrates Carl even more and more with the Syndicate, and he can't lash out because they have rules against that that'll make his time in the dungeon a little bit harder. And ultimately, the point is the whole system is unfair and exploitative. As I said before, like, greed and capitalism seem to run amok, and when that happens, like, you get a very ugly reality. Things do not look great. Things were not looking great for Dungeon or for Carl on the surface of the Earth, but now that he's in the dungeon, he has to murder and not feel anything in order to be able to continue to go on and on. There are other great elements to the story. I do think Carl's character development is pretty good. At the beginning of the story, he's very hesitant to, connect with others, especially when he first enters into the dungeon. And he even says, I'm not one for drama. I don't want to get involved in that sort of thing. I'm adverse to it, which is why he's breaking up with his girlfriend at the beginning of the story. But as time goes on, he becomes more and more involved and willing to sort of help out the vulnerable. You see that with the retirement home crew that he's helping out, but also when he gets invited on another TV show called Death Watch, which is led by a bully of a host. The host is kind of like making fun of these other dungeon crawlers who are on the verge of death and who are plucked from that situation just to be on the show, and they're going to be returned there afterwards. And Carl's like, put me in there instead. I'll stand up, or I'll help them fight off these creatures, which they're not going to do. They're not going to let Carl do that. And Carl doesn't really want to do that, but he's doing it as a means to kind of get back at this corrupt corporation, these people who just laugh at death and don't care that people are actually dying in these dungeons. Like, actual people are actually dying, and it's treated like a game, which that's what it is, but it's also not a game. So we see Carl's character development. It really makes him a rad character. Kind of headstrong and not really understanding the consequences to everything that he's doing. But sometimes you need to be like that in order to do good in the world. So I do think Carl's character development is great. The video game logic that the story runs on is pretty interesting, but at the same time, it is also a drawback because I do think like the idea of a tutorial slows the book down. Like it's trying to do a little bit of world building, which I can understand, but at the same time, like, this seems more conducive for it being a video game, and this isn't a video game, it's a book. Like, you're trying to tell a story, but then you just stop everything to be like, here's your inventory system, here's how the rules work, and here's what you can and you can't do. And that does help us kind of better understand the story later on, but at the same time, again, it just drags down the story. It really messes with the overall pacing, and just creates a sense that maybe this isn't the best media to tell this kind of story. I have heard that there's probably going to be attempts to adapt it into like a TV show or something, and I really wonder if that's even possible, given that this is such a visual sort of medium where you have to read things, and nobody's going to watch a TV show where there's going to have to be a lot of reading, or they're just like reading things at you. I do think the set pieces of the show, particularly with the Rage Elemental Demon, is really well done. And I think Dinniman's storytelling is pretty interesting because he does a lot of clue-based storytelling. Like, he's letting the readers kind of figure out what's happening before he arrives and has Carl say exactly what's happening. A really good point is when Carl is talking to Frank in the safe room. Earlier we see Carl eat a cookie that gives him experience points, but it splits it between Princess Donut and Carl. Carl gets 9.8, Princess Donut gets 0.2 because they're part of a squad, a group. And when Carl is talking to Frank, a lot of things don't add up for Carl, but one thing is that Frank eats the cookie and he gets 9.8 experience points, and that must mean that there's someone else who's getting those 0.2. Frank says that he's on his own, and we, the reader, can come to understand that doesn't line up. Even before Carl says anything, we can kind of understand that Frank is lying to us, and that Carl, shit is about to go down, basically. And Dinniman does a really good job of allowing the reader to kind of get to that point on their own, by doing a lot of great setup and kind of building things up. Again, that's kind of the video game logic coming into play. So maybe it's not a complete loss or hindrance to the plot, but it overall just creates for some interesting storytelling that makes this worth reading. I do also think a problem that I have with this story is the way that it ends. It's very anticlimactic. In that you have the rage elemental, which should be where the story naturally kind of ends, or it's the apex of the story. But then you have several things that kind of happen after that. You have Carl going on death watch. You have the Frank and Maggie thing happening, where he meets Frank and Maggie again and finds out that he accidentally killed Maggie's daughter. There's a fake sex tape thing that happens related to that. They start training a pet, which is a weird place to kind of put that. And then Carl runs into Agatha, someone who is with the retirement home crew, and learns that she might not be who she says she is, and then he heads down to the third floor, presumably. And while that is pretty interesting, it feels like weird pacing, because the rage elemental thing is the high point of the show, of it. It's the climax. It feels like that should be the climax, and then everything else just feels like additional things that kind of happen. It doesn't feel like very good storytelling. It doesn't follow the normal beats that things have to happen. And so you just end with a bunch of just random things that feel like an epilogue, but it's not quite an epilogue. And ultimately, I think it's a problem with what Matt Dinniman is trying to do here. He's already told you there's going to be 18 floors, and he can't possibly tell that entire story in one book. Maybe he can, but he's not doing that here. So this is going to be multiple installments. So you already have to wait until he finishes all those installments to get the complete story, which we've seen problems with, George R. R. Martin and other writers about that, how you might not end up getting that. So that could leave you with a feeling of incompletion. But the other issue is that it requires such a time investment at that point, and it also messes with the pacing of the stories, because you're no longer ending the story at a natural conclusion point. It does feel like it ends at an okay point, but not the best point here. But because Matt Dinniman has already said himself about creating, those 18 floors of stories, some stories are going to end in a very strange place, and it also might feel a little bit gimmicky. So if the gimmick for a particular book doesn't work, it's going to make it harder to go back into it and get into that if you decide to reread it in the future. So rereadability might be a little bit shot here and there. But ultimately, the way that he ends it feels, just kind of strange. He has something in mind for how he wants to tell the story, and he's just ending it wherever. But that's not how storytelling usually works, and you're ending up with a huge problem in that, the book doesn't function as something by itself. You have to consider it in connection with everything else. And I have a general problem with that, because Hollywood has decided to start doing that. And that's not how we should be telling stories. We should be telling coherent stories that have defined endings, rather than just waiting for, the next thing to come along. Anyway, those are my thoughts on Dungeon Crawler Carl. I enjoyed the book. I am definitely going to read the sequels, but I still think there are a whole host of problems that come along with the book that I think are only going to be amplified in future volumes. I think that's a problem with fantasy and sci-fi in general, especially when you have writers who set out to write a series rather than setting out to write a coherent individual story that might stand on its own. Because I think you can do that and then also tell future stories and combine them to create a series, leave a few breadcrumbs for later. But that's not what a lot of writers really intend to do. I'm probably the only not the only, but I'm probably one of the few people who are actually complaining about this. I'm sure the other people who are reading this are fine with that sort of development, but it is a personal problem for me, I would say. So just something to consider there. But yeah, if you read this before, or you simply want to comment on something I said here, let me know in the comments below. I would love to hear from you. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out about this book or this author if they don't know about either. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and dungeon crawling travels. Farewell.